Hello, everybody, and welcome to this first SuDS Pillar Talk, which will be looking at SuDS and water quantity. Before we begin, I would like to thank our partners and supporters. And like most of series projects, susdrain would not happen, and nor would this webcast happen without the financial and moral support of our partners and supporters. So this is a thank you to our partners and supporters for making this possible. And you can find out more about susdrain and our partners and supporters by visiting our website at www.susdrain.org. And if you'd like to be involved in susdrain, please do also get in contact with us. So my name is Paul Schaffer, and I coordinate series work on blue-green infrastructure that includes our work on SuDS and susdrain. So if you didn't know, susdrain is a project that we've set up to share good practice on SuDS with the hope to inspire, inform, and influence those involved in SuDS delivery. This webcast is the first of a series covering the SuDS pillars. So apologies if you misheard or misread the promotion for this podcast and you thought it was about something else completely, but we are talking about the SuDS pillars. So these SuDS pillars set the high-level objectives and benefits for SuDS, these being managing the quantity and quality of runoff, creating better places and spaces for people and nature through delivering amenity and biodiversity benefits. We're covering each of these pillars in 4 webcasts, 3 of which will be next week, and I will be joined by 4 experts for each pillar. And they will share their thoughts on the opportunities, challenges, and good practice involved in delivering SuDS that deliver against those SuDS pillars. So as you know, today's webcast is on managing water quantity. So this first question is, what role do you have in SuDS delivery? Are you an approver, practitioner or designer, developer or client, or other, in terms of you not being any of the previous 3 options? Okay, so we've got 50% of you are from practitioners and designers, and 26% are approvers, and 8% are developers or clients. So welcome to you all, and I hope you do find something useful during the session. So the program for this webcast is we've got Bridget Woods-Ballard from HR Wallingford, and I'm delighted to say that she's going to be joining us to deal with some of the opportunities and challenges there are with managing water quantity and delivering SuDS. And I've had the pleasure of working with Bridget on numerous SuDS projects over the years, including 2 editions of the SuDS manual and development of the SuDS standards. So Bridget's a civil engineer and hydrologist, and she's been involved in a large number of projects on SuDS performance, costs, opportunities, and liabilities. And she also delivers training for HR Wallingford on SuDS as well. So this session is a very simple format. Bridget will provide an overview of SuDS and water quality, and then we hope to have a discussion that will be fueled by your questions. So please do take the opportunity to raise questions as we go through. Otherwise, it'd just be an informal chat with Bridget and myself talking about SuDS delivery. And as I said, we will then finish at around 1:30. And but in that time, please do sit back, enjoy, and fire over these questions. So, Bridget.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for asking me to talk today in your exciting new podcast series. And I'd just like to say how thrilled I am to be your first guinea pig. So I've been asked to talk about the quantity pillar. I wanted to say that I don't think Paul has really explained the pillars, but the quantity pillar is really where SuDS started. And today I'm going to talk about its journey from being a central pillar, freestanding pretty much, to more of a cornerstone that works with and integrate and supports the other 3 to deliver the outcomes that we want. Okay, that's better. To start with, Let's take away the quantity a bit of the question and focus on the water. In this country, we have mostly been blessed with an abundance of rainfall that gives us green countryside and beautiful rivers full of wildlife. But I think it's clear to us all now that this is something we've taken too much for granted. For years, we've developed that countryside. We've stripped away the vegetation, we've sealed over and compacted the soils, and we've drained the runoff with gullies and pipes. As an industrial and commercial society, this approach has served us well and has been celebrated. We've kept water off our roads, away from our properties and our infrastructure. We don't expect to notice water as part of development, and we've pretty low tolerances of flooding. We've combined rainfall with sewage and treated it as a waste product for disposal. As drainage designers, these have been our objectives and have also fundamentally defined the expectations of the society that we serve. Moving on, we've come to recognise three key things. Firstly, the impacts of the efficiency of those drainage systems. Secondly, the implications of their fixed capacities. And thirdly, the impact of taking water out of development landscapes and out of the lives of the communities that live there. Let's talk about these in a little bit more detail. So number one, the efficiency of our drainage systems. We've come to recognise that our efficiency in removing runoff from our developments means that we're inadvertently putting flooding stress on our rivers. In their natural state, our rivers and streams respond slowly to rainfall. Plants and soils become gradually wetter, water filters through soils to groundwater, depressions fill, and runoff eventually occurs that is itself slowed and stored in natural drainage paths. Compare this to the runoff into our rivers that our rivers receive from pipe networks. That arrives very differently. It's very fast and nothing has been lost. So the river has to deal with all the entire volume of rainfall, which it may well not have the capacity to do. The reality is that we need our drainage systems to mimic those natural systems, infiltrating water, holding it back on site, close to where the rain falls, using a SuDS approach. And if we do that, then we have the opportunity to use it for a wide range of societal and ecosystem services. It becomes that natural capital that we've got used to throwing away. Number two, the implications of our fixed capacity systems. We've come to recognise that we can't design drainage systems to accommodate every scale of rainfall event. Pipe systems have a fixed capacity, and beyond that, the system will be surcharged and flooding will occur. We clearly need to make sure that our development landscape is designed in such a way that the consequences of flooding are minimised. We don't want our properties flooding, but perhaps we're prepared to accept road and car park flooding infrequently. The problem with managing these risks for pipe networks is that once they're full, they tend to fail suddenly and without warning, which usually poses substantial risks. In contrast, water levels in SuDS rise gradually, and we can see what's happening. And take the necessary action at the right time if floods do occur. And also, because of their reliance on soils and vegetation, SuDS components are inherently less sensitive to additional inflows. Number three, taking our water out of the development. Here we've come to recognise that bringing our conveyance and our storage systems close to the surface or to the surface, just like those natural drainage features, that's going to maximise the natural losses we can secure. It's going to connect people to, rather than separate people from, water. We can use the water to cool our urban areas and add beauty, and it will help reinstate those water-dependent natural habitats that we are losing rapidly. A SuDS approach is therefore going to provide us with a better chance for a more resilient future. More resilience with respect to flooding risks and sewer overflow risks, more resilience with respect to protecting our water environment and our water resources, more resilience with respect to the livability of our urban space under climate change, and more resilience with respect to protecting our biodiversity. So let's have a think about now about the rules that govern our designs. We have standards and we have guidance, and these have promoted gradual change over the last 20 years. The absolute rules, in particular those ones that are defined in the non-statutory technical standards for SuDS in England, they've tended to focus on this pillar, the quantity pillar, keeping in check the rates of runoff from development and specifying the scale of the event for which we'll tolerate a degree of flooding. But our good practice guidance contains much broader criteria. And the talks next week, as Paul mentioned, are going to cover the essential other three pillars: the quality, the amenity, and the biodiversity. Our rules on quantity also cover some important evolving threats that are putting further pressure on our water systems, those of climate change and of urban creep. As our data sets improve and our science develops, we have begun to understand the impacts on rainfall of the evolving shifts in our climate. The intensity and volume of a rainfall event that historically may have only occurred once every 5 years may now occur every year or every couple of years. And significant changes in more extreme rainfall depths are also expected, potentially up to a 40% increase between now and the end of a new development's design life. Furthermore, the development itself is unlikely to remain as originally built. Properties tend to be extended, gardens are paved over, meaning we need to take account of that extra future impermeability. Both climate change and urban creep mean that far more storage is needed in our new drainage systems to deliver the same level of performance. With underground networks, that extra storage can realistically only be delivered as an increase in pipe size or tank volume. With SuDS, however, there's more flexibility. Areas adjacent to the drainage system that might be routinely used as recreational amenity space can potentially be designed to accommodate flooding from the more extreme events without any loss of value. It's only going to happen once in 30 or 50 years. And if these pressures happen to be worse than anticipated, then the impact's going to be very low. Whilst we can take account of these threats in new systems through good design, the sprawling drainage networks beneath our existing towns and cities in most cases cannot economically be adapted. Sewers tend to be very sensitive to additional loads, which means flooding inevitably becomes more frequent. The implications of that mix of sewage and surface water in combined networks also means that during heavy rainfall, there are spills of untreated effluent into the environment. And that is a situation that the public is increasingly aware of and increasingly unwilling to accept. So we're now urgently considering how we can better manage those surface water contributions to those underground networks. And the answer lies, at least in part, in using SuDS that harvest water, promote infiltration and natural losses, and slow the remaining flows to very low rates. And we have evidence that these retrofit SuDS are working. For example, we've got great examples of those implemented in Greener Grangetown in Cardiff and in Countess Creek in West London. They're doing just what we want, protecting our sewers, whilst also putting wildlife and natural beauty back into urban environments. So Paul asked me to talk about current practice. I think to define current practice is quite difficult. It's so varied, and we must acknowledge the huge number of high quality designs that have emerged in recent years. Many of those schemes have won susdrain awards, and I would really encourage you to look at and be inspired by the susdrain award winners that are written up as case studies on the susdrain website. However, unfortunately, alongside that, for a large number of developments, it's clear that progress has been slow. Despite having industry guidance that advocates those multiple benefits, the influence of the non-statutory technical standards for SuDS and of just industry historic expertise, survey evidence from a recent Aqua project shows the prevalence of tank storage solutions. That's also supported by the SciWem Big SuDS survey and has been further supported by surveys that we've done more recently for the update of the national standards. You can see from these quotes, a piped surface system, water system with attenuation via oversized pipes and a restricted discharge may be defined as SuDS under our current standards. And where higher quality SuDS are aspired to, systems often adopt pipe to pond systems that offer few benefits and can be problematic to manage. I think end of pipe storage, although obviously often an improvement on a completely subsurface solution, does bring problems. They're not just hydraulic ones, but focusing on the quantity, with storage only in one place with a single flow control, the volume required becomes very large and can often only be delivered on land that's slightly separated rather than integrated with the development. The problems are exacerbated on flat sites where the pipe network has to be laid at self-cleansing gradients, and as a result, the discharge point into that pond or basin may be many meters below ground level. But where opportunities are taken to distribute SuDS through the site with multiple control points, integrating the surface water management with the road areas, with the private curtilages, within private curtilages and within public open space, and maximizing those natural losses across the site, then storage can become more efficient and volumes and land take can be reduced. So on that point, I just want to take this opportunity to think a little bit more about losses. Let's consider what a focus on peak flow control without a focus on controlling the volume looks like. So the good news, obviously, is that if we have lower peak flow rates, and when the river, the receiving watercourse is in flood, then those lower flow rates will be very much welcomed and in order to protect flood risk. The bad news is we have that extra rate, that rate discharging over a much longer period, because of all the extra volume of runoff that has been generated by those sealed surfaces. And that extra volume in itself could cause flooding when rivers or sewers are already full. Further bad news comes from the high velocity runoff that will occur from piped networks for everyday rainfall events. So over 70% of our rainfall events are normally less than 5 millimeters in depth. And for the vast majority of the year, these events would cause no runoff at all from natural soils. The impact to rivers of all those runoff events is bank erosion, pollution, and a lowering of base flows. The flow monitoring done in Cambridgeshire at the Lamb Drove SuDS sites by Cambridgeshire County Council and Royal Haskoning shows us this difference very clearly. The red line is the conventionally drained control site. It shows that there's immediate runoff from rainfall. As soon as it rains, you have a discharge. It shows us the very rapid rates of runoff. You can see the high peaks there. And it shows us the large volume of runoff, which is the area under that graph. However, it also shows us the discharge from a SuDS site, which is in green. And it shows us how well those SuDS are working. There's no response from the SuDS until after about 8 millimeters of rainfall has fallen. The peak rates are about 10 times lower than the control site rates, and the volumes are also substantially less. So this is exactly the sort of response that we want to be aiming for to protect our environment. So the last question Paul wanted me to answer is, where do we need to be going? Other countries have recognized that designing just for extreme events has its limitations. Germany's move towards using a local water balance as a benchmark for water sensitive design. China requires runoff volumes, groundwater recharge, and evapotranspiration volumes to be matched annually, so, on an annual basis. And it also requires water to be used as a non-potable resource in areas where resources are stressed. These criteria form the basis of China's shift towards sponge cities approach for all their major new development areas. Such approaches need to use alternative types of design rainfall. They need to use rainfall that represent the complete scale of events occurring through the year, most likely developing drainage solutions using a time series of rainfall for over many years, rather than those individual design events that we use. And I think this should be an aspiration for us into the future. Here in the UK, we do have industry guidance that in the SuDS manual that recommends controlling volume as well as peak flow rates, and also recommends the use or retention of this 5 mil of rainfall, a design approach we describe as interception. We've seen from the monitoring how effective SuDS can be at replicating a more natural catchment response. And we know that actually we can achieve this even when those components are not actually designed to infiltrate water. SuDS do naturally lose water just because of the fact that they're using vegetation and soils. They don't have to, they can even be on more impermeable soils, which means that interception can be delivered by a huge range of SuDS components, from infiltration and rainwater harvesting to swales, basins, pavements, and bioretention. HR Wallingford have recently looked at how beneficial the use of widespread SuDS could be for sewer capacity. And the results demonstrate that the benefits for flooding and for CSO spills could be significant, with CSO spills in particular benefiting from infiltration, from interception criterion. But those benefits are not easy to achieve, and they do require extensive catchment coverage. So, not an immediate panacea, but evidence that of the opportunities that for using retrofit SuDS when we can to achieve local benefits and also gradual improvements in our resilience of our systems. And we need to recognise that this infiltration approach will do far, far more than just modify the hydraulic response from the site. It will help integrate components that manage water quality, amenity, and biodiversity throughout the landscape and the built form of our urban fabric. The key message that I want to leave you with is that I think we need to reset our focus. We need a shift from thinking about drainage and runoff control as a solely flood risk management function towards embedding surface water management firmly within the development planning process, part of building design, as part of hard and soft landscape design and green infrastructure delivery, as part of the ecology strategy for the site, as part of water resource management, and as a part of achieving environmental net gain. I think we need a new philosophy where water itself is that central building block, that pillar even around which development is planned and designed. We've reached a point where we can't any longer afford to take water for granted. We need to manage our surface water for the everyday events and not just the once or twice in a lifetime. And I'm confident that drainage engineers can work alongside planners, architects, landscape architects, and ecologists to make that change a reality. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that, Bridget. That was a great overview of where we are with regards to managing water quantity. So again, please, if anything there is sparks some questions or some queries, please do use the Q&A. And in the interim, we have our second poll. So if we can run that, that would be great. So how often do the SuDS schemes you're involved in, whether it's assessing or designing, deliver more than managing flows and volumes? And the options are all of the time, some of the time, or never. Okay. So as you can see, the vast majority do more than just manage flows and volumes. So over nearly 70% of the respondents have said that they do it some of the time, 16% all of the time, and 15% never. So that's quite interesting itself. So it looks like for the majority of times we're trying to deliver more than just flood risk management. So before we go on to the questions, I'll just take the prerogative to ask a question to Bridget. So it's been 5 years since we worked on the SuDS manual, Bridget. I suppose really what do you think's changed the most significantly over that time, and how do you think things might change in the future?
I think the SuDS manual actually does, in terms of its coverage of all the aspects, I think it actually does pretty well. I think it's a lot. Having a non-statutory standards that only focus on quantity, and also all the processes that the processes of adoption and approval and how those lie and are implemented within local authorities are there are a lot of barriers to those multiple benefits, in addition to the education and awareness and training that we need. But I think the incentives aren't necessarily there at the moment. But I think they're coming. I think that the policy, there is a huge amount of government policy and drivers now that are suggesting and pushing developments into considering a much more broad range of environmental and social benefits. And I think the challenge is going to be embedding SuDS and the value that SuDS can contribute to that within those considerations. Having said that, I do think there's lots we could do with the SuDS manual. I think it needs, we could, in splitting out water quantity and quality, amenity and biodiversity, I think we might have been sort of supporting those splits and not supporting necessarily a really integrated approach. So I think we probably refocus it on the development planning process, on integrating the systems together at an early stage, and how to address runoff from each surface to get that best solution.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you, Bridget. I think looking back over the last 5 years, that I think when we started looking at the SuDS manual, the concept of multiple benefits wasn't really well established. And as time's gone on, we've had the MPPS come forward. We've got the 25-year plan that all talk about multiple benefits within the context of blue-green infrastructure, and natural capital and ecosystem services. So I think the conversation's changed more about what we can do in terms of opportunities rather than the solving the problem of flood risk. So I think how we shift from that problem solving to that placemaking and that design element is going to be really crucial. I agree.
It's all very well having it in policy, it's embedding it in practice that's the challenge, isn't it?
You've got the numbers that have come up, so great. So just skimming through those. Okay, so we have a question here that says, can you provide any advice in controlling the first 5 millimeter where infiltration is not feasible? Green roofs only deal with the buildings themselves by their nature. Without infiltration, surely discharge volume at ground level will be discharged following all rainfall events, irrespective of the reduced rate of runoff.
So if it's a lot to do with the perviousness. So when I say perviousness, is what we're trying to do is make developments a bit more spongy, like the Chinese. We're trying to so if we can make impervious surfacing permeable, so if we can and have storage beneath it, even where the soils beneath that are not permeable, so we're not actually physically expecting a large volume of infiltration, we will still lose water. So we've done monitoring on pervious pavement, on permeable pavements with gravel fill that are actually themselves lined with an impermeable liner, and you still lose that 5 mil of rainfall because just from the wetting up of the gravel fill inside and the fact that you're the slowing flows and securing losses. When we talk about interception, we're not talking about losing, retaining or losing it for every single rainfall event. That there are always going to be events where it's been very wet in winter months, and you will get immediate runoff. But those aren't the events we're really aiming for. We're aiming for where there is dryness in the system that can be wetted up. So swales will even if they're on clay soils, you will still not get any runoff for the first 5 mil for the majority of events during the year, providing you're not putting hectares and hectares and hectares of runoff into it. So it's a question of balancing the inflow to the swale and the swale size, and there are rules for that in the SuDS manuals, and some deemed to comply rules, which at least form the first step to getting a reasonably robust design for that.
Great, thank you for that question, and also thanks for the answer, Bridget. There's a question here around language that's come from Emily Clark from Angling Water. She says, at Angling Water, we call our treatment works water recycling centres. A lot of what we collectively do is around changing the language we use. Have you got any thoughts about the language that we use around water quantity, Bridget?
Yeah, well, I think, as I mentioned, I think we have linked our drainage systems. Well, drainage in itself implies taking water away very quickly. So I think there is a bit of an issue there. We've then run off control as being the next thing, or the next term, which also implies that we're just trying to control the volume and not do anything with it. So I think management has got to be in there. So we do need to think about surface water management. I know lots of people tell Paul that it shouldn't be called SuDS anymore, but I think we're in a place where to change the name is probably counterproductive. I know in the States they're constantly changing the name of what they're doing, from low impact development and best management practices, and so they've gone through probably 5 or 10 names.
I think it's that. I think there's a few terms. I think that the term sustainable turns people off. They think that can't be defined, and then drainage doesn't necessarily excite people. And then there's an acronym of SuDS, and people get confused thinking it might be baths or beer.
Washing machines.
Exactly. So I think for me, the outcomes that a good SuDS design delivers probably needs to be where we start, rather than trying to think about some of the language. I think trying to sell a view of what it's like with sustainable drainage is easier to actually get people on side than it would be to start using the terminology. So great. Right, so thank you for that.
Paul might retire if we change the name.
I'd be happy to. If we get better outcomes, I'm fine with that. So I think there's a few questions coming in from Charles Tucker and Lorna Devonish that I think focus on how do we encourage developers to put water holistically at their centre of development, and maybe do more than just managing the control and volume of runoff.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I think there are a lot of challenges in terms of the incentives to do that, especially when amongst the developers, the economics don't necessarily, or they don't perceive that the economics stack up for doing that. There's a perception that land take for SuDS is much greater, integrated SuDS is much greater, and it's a big shift in standard practice. So I think there's a lot to do with education and awareness raising and training, and then I think I'm hoping that an update of the non-statutory technical standards and to encompass all those multiple benefits, but also to highlight the roles of functions wider than just planning and drainage. So trying to embed the process throughout the planning, the design and planning approval process. But without these things being mandatory, perhaps we're just, we are probably just looking at a gradual, as Sue Illman says, nibbling approach to trying to incrementally get a step improvements. I think the planning white paper, wherever that goes, offers some perhaps interesting possibilities with respect to setting out more templates of how you might deliver that for certain development types. And the other thing is that we've got other manuals being updated. The manual for streets, hoping that I'm not actually aware of what's going into that, but I'm hoping that's going to have a more comprehensive integration of SuDS within that. Paul probably knows more about that than I do. I think everybody's realizing how important planning is, which I think means that the planning documents and the planning framework is getting quite
heavy in terms of actually what needs to be achieved. And from speaking to the people that are developing the urban design codes, I know they've been getting an awful lot of input and an awful lot of other topics to be included in there. And I think they're struggling to keep reference and relevance to SuDS and water within that. And likewise, I think Manual for Streets, I think the update's going to be happening in the new year. And I know that they recognise there's a strong dependency with regards to highways and planning. So I think
the planning white paper specifically references tree-lined, only tree-lined streets, which the worry might be if those tree-lined streets were put in and the trees, but the trees didn't receive any water. So I think that sort of sums up how crucial it is to get the integration with SuDS with these new proposals and policy proposals.
And I think as a discipline, I think civil engineers and drainage engineers aren't necessarily the first to be engaged when people are dealing with design of developments and also developers thinking about how much land is required for their infrastructure and their housing. So I think there's an awful lot of things that we need to do to try and promote the value of good drainage in terms of helping support those tree-lined streets and that blue and green infrastructure.
And the fact that the SuDS aren't necessarily more costly. They with good design and especially with good integration. As I said, we can make. It's about making the most of every element, every aspect of space that there is on a site. And I think when we wrote the SuDS manual before, we kept away from these templates of design. We thought we felt that SuDS should be unique and individual, and we should just be referencing objectives for the design rather than telling people exactly how to do it. But I think probably we need to move away from that and just give people lots of clear templates about how to deliver that integrated SuDS through a site for different scales of site and for different types of site.
Yeah, I think we focused on typologies, didn't we, for different sites and different types. And it might be that we might need to provide some other opportunities and palettes for what SuDS could look like in certain developments.
Yeah.
There's a question here, Bridget, that says, how do you think local planning authorities can be engaged better to help them understand the need for space for SuDS? So this takes a higher priority in the planning process in the absence of government policy.
I think you might be better answering that, Paul, than me.
I think whenever we've done research into this, I think there is an element here of the planning and development process, but I think it's also how far upstream that process do you go in terms of the land allocation, the land buying process. So I really don't think it's just a case of thinking about what the planning authorities can do and what the developers can do. I think it's about what we can do as an overall process to try and ensure that there is a better outcome for SuDS.
I think the pre-application process has got to be key, hasn't it? We've got to. It's about making sure that planners are sufficiently well informed at when they undertake pre-applications, and it's about making sure that developers realise the benefit of that. I mean, if we can't get SuDS considered right at the start, then all the benefits and all the efficiencies as well actually are significantly reduced. Yeah.
I think what I've heard during the time when talk about pre-application is that some think that pre-application is still too late, but we can't even secure pre-application discussions. So I think hopefully the changes that come out from the planning white paper and this process in terms of checklists and design performers and what have you may enable SuDS to be more readily and easily considered right from outset.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm just scanning through the questions. We've got a number of questions still. And I understand it's not possible to vote on the questions that come through, so apologies if you're having to take just the questions that jump out at me. So There's a question here from Lorna Devonish. Do you think that SuDS designers sometimes overlook rainwater harvesting because it's plastic tanks and not natural, even though they can provide multiple benefits, including attenuation in smart systems and rainwater reuse?
Yeah, I think we need to have a bigger focus on rainwater harvesting and how we can use that more effectively, especially in the southeast of England. I mean, you only have to look at the data figures on the supply-demand balance in the southeast, and the fact that within the next 10, 20 years, there's a really crucial resource crisis, and we shouldn't be throwing water away. So whether we're using water, whether we're harvesting water for the landscape, just to give us all the landscape benefits that we need to provide that irrigation, source of water for irrigation potentially, or whether we're using it for other non-potable uses in our buildings, I think it's fundamental that we take those opportunities. So I think rainwater harvesting needs to be up there and given full consideration alongside the other multiple benefits. And yes, there's lots of technology now, so that allows rainwater harvesting systems to be used in a smart way, so that they can provide that attenuation, storage, and the water supply benefits. So hopefully the update to the non-statutory standards will include rainwater harvesting as a destination that and require and encourage people to give it more consideration early in the process.
Right, thank you for that, Bridget. There's a question here, which is always something that I tend to discuss in a pub, which normally means it gets quite lively. This question, Bridget, is what discipline should lead SuDS design? Landscaping people rather than traditional pipe engineers, perhaps?
Yeah, that's something that's been sort of raised quite a lot recently, hasn't it? I would like to say, as a drainage engineer and a civil engineer, I would like to think that actually we can do this, and we can, and it is still within our sort of our remit, but that we need to form these integrated teams, and we need to make sure we've got enough expertise from ecologists and landscape architects to make sure that we're securing all those benefits, and that we're managing our flows and our velocities and our volumes in a way that's most supportive to delivering the amenity and biodiversity benefits and water quality benefits that we need. So, but I think it really has to be teamwork. Although perhaps in the future you will have dedicated degree courses on just SuDS design that will draw on all those disciplines and provide the perfect solution.
Great, thank you for that, Bridget. So Emily's come back on the question and discussion we had before. So Emily said that she wasn't suggesting we rename SuDS. She meant that we need the general public to get on board with us and demand more of our policies and processes. So it's more mainstream and business as usual. And she says, I wonder if we stop calling it wastewater as though it's a problem that we need to resolve, rather than a precious resource, whether we would get the public's buy-in to do more in our communities.
Yeah, I think the public pressure, I don't know whether that's realistic, but I do think that there's increasingly the amount of podcasts and media attention on this area, particularly on the sort of green infrastructure area, is only increasing, and I think that there is lots of evidence to suggest that where people do have good SuDS on a site, they are very supportive of them and do recognise their value. I think public education is important, and we did actually discuss yesterday when we're re-looking at the SuDS standards about the importance of information boards and education boards, and whether that should be something that was specifically referenced in a new standards document. So yes, without mandatory standards that require this, with public pressures, that is important.
I think when we've always talked about this in meetings and projects, there's the policy driver in terms of trying to get elected members involved, but there's also the power of people in terms of trying to get SuDS in the ground. And we just keep on wishing at one stage there will be a Retrofit rain garden in Coronation Street, and maybe bits of Albert Square would have a rain garden. So I think it is changing. I think if you explain what's trying to be achieved with sustainable drainage to the public, I think they invariably get it. It is common sense, and if you can show them what a nice looking rain garden looks like, I think people would prefer that. But I do think there is an element that we can do.
But they still pave over their front gardens with concrete.
Yeah, if there's an opportunity of explaining there's a different way to actually park their car and still actually manage water a bit better. So, but I think when the point you made there, Bridget, about paving is true. Whenever I've been involved as a fly on the wall looking at retrofitting, whenever we talk to communities, there was concern about where they put their car. So, and what happens with the rain garden taking up a car parking space. So, okay. So I'm just scanning through them. Have you seen any good examples of community-driven SuDS rather than it being led by councils, statutory undertakers, or developers? So, I mean, this is a question really around retrofitting, and I've seen some really good examples actually of retrofit SuDS, and these, I mean, London Borough of Enfield have delivered some really great schemes of retrofit SuDS in public open spaces and public, where they've worked with the friends of a park or a field in terms of driving forward SuDS. The community-driven SuDS tends to be more retrofit rather than new build, and I think there are some.
Is that to address a particular flooding problem that the community is experiencing?
I think it's a bit of both. I think the local authority recognise there's a challenge around some of the culverts and capacity, but also that the local community can potentially see what the benefits might be to actually having better blue-green infrastructure locally.
I think there are great SuDS award winners this year in the retrofit category, showing some of which I think are sort of more community-led schemes, which are really demonstrate how much value a bit of public open space, how retrofit SuDS can transform that space into something very much of greater value to a community.
Okay.
Hopefully the water companies, the new design and construction guidance, which allows water companies to adopt SuDS, and also the fact that water companies or sewage undertakers are looking at ways to increase sewer capacity or increase resilience of sewer systems. I think that's going to drive a lot more thinking about where in networks water companies can secure benefits through retrofit SuDS, and that should hopefully bring SuDS more into the community arena when they see bits adjacent to roads being dug up and rain gardens being put in, like Greener Grangetown. I mean, assume that has created a massive community involvement there.
Yeah, I think that's in terms of the community engagement and the level of delivery there. That's immense, and I think that's probably a really good example of how engagement with the community has taken things forward. I'm not necessarily sure whether I can readily find examples where communities have driven the delivery of it. I think that might come down to probably best. I might need to engage with some of the catchment-based partnerships out there in terms of trying to find that.
I suppose the question is whether we think communities would be prepared to help maintain SuDS. And I think that's an interesting thought going forward. So if they start getting involved in their maintenance, then perhaps that again raises awareness and understanding of surface water management.
And that's a good link or segue to a proposal that we've just released about work that we'd like to do on enabling communities to undertake maintenance of local flood risk management assets, trying to understand whether there's an appetite for that to happen and see how that can be supported by risk management authorities. So if you're a consultant that has some experience in that, we'd love to hear from you, and there might be opportunities to bid for some work. So please look on our website for new opportunities. So there's a question here that says, so this is from Paul Hancock. So it's a question that says, SuDS schemes are perhaps easier to justify and deliver on large developments. However, a lot of development is small scale, but the collective impact of the number of smaller schemes may be underestimated. What's the view on how SuDS should be applied on varying size schemes, and should different approaches be adopted?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point about the significance of small sites in terms of contributing to receiving networks, because the huge proportion of our planning applications are less than a hectare in size, and that will tend to mean that we often include a minimum limiting discharge rate. So it might be 5 or 6 litres a second, which when you actually work, that if it's a hectare site, that's 5 litres per second per hectare, which is quite high. If it's half a hectare site, then that's 10 litres per second per hectare. So so that can then, when you add all, cumulatively, that can add a big significant extra load to our receiving watercourses. So I think we do need to establish mechanisms through which smaller sites also include suitable subsystems, and there are lots of opportunities using driveways, using rain gardens, traditional soakaways, just small components that, and potentially using the subsurface as well to maximise infiltration beneath driveways, potentially green roofs on garaging. I think we can't ignore the small sites. We've got to make this a solution for all sites. There may be occasional exceptions where it just doesn't make sense, but I think if you ask, I think people have found solutions for every scale of site, and if it means that we need to create more templates for small sites, then perhaps we do, but I don't think it's an excuse not to deliver on the standards and criteria.
Completely, and I think with the implementation of the Welsh statutory SuDS standards, where they haven't had a colour for the size of the development, I think they're trying to tackle approaches for delivering SuDS and small schemes there. So there might be a few more examples coming forward from Wales in the coming months. So very conscious of time and the fact that we've answered 11 questions. By my reckoning, Bridget, and there's 60 questions still there, so we might need to think about what we do for the future. Which I just want to say thank you to the audience, and thank you to you for your time in answering that. I think we've got one last poll, so this comes back down to the opportunities for delivering multiple benefits. So this one is, what's the biggest challenge in delivering integrated SuDS components to distributors over a site rather than just end-of-pipe storage solution, which I know is slightly different from what we've got on the slide. So the options we had were concerns about land take, design or modelling challenges, adoption constraints, SuDS design happening after development layouts are finalised, and a mixture of all of the above. And the most popular one is a mixture of all of the above, which is probably what we would expect. So great. So that it's probably drawing an end to our session. So Bridget, again, thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
I know holding a session on your own is quite daunting. For me, the time went fast. My throat's a bit sore. I don't know how yours is. But I want to thank you for your time that you put into putting together your presentation and answering those questions. I also want to thank the audience for the questions, and apologies that we couldn't get through some of those. We'll work out how we can cover those maybe in a future session, and maybe when we think about bringing together all of our panelists that we have for the podcast, we might want to think about ways that we can just answer some questions, because I'm sure there'll be some questions that our specialists on amenity and biodiversity and water quality would like to answer. So I want to take this opportunity to thank our partners and supporters, of which HR Wallingford is one, and wish you all a good afternoon. So thank you for your time.
And happy Christmas.
Yeah, happy Christmas. Nearly forgot.
Thank you.
Thank you.